Presents from Brown Santa. Gonna be doing an install today. As you can see on the side of the boxes, we got some new presents from Rancho. Alright, shock. Relocation bracket. Rear bump stop extension. Rear sway bar link. Miscellaneous hardware. Looks like a rear coil. Bump stop extensions for the front. Relocation brackets. Front shock. Front coil. Miscellaneous hardware. Instructions. Alright, so for those of you who've been following our videos, you know that we've been running around on a 2.5-inch budget boost. And while that's been getting the job done for us, there have been a few limitations, mainly with the shocks not being able to keep up with the new unsprung weight that we have with our 37-inch tires and beadlock wheels. And more recently than not, what we've started to see is that our factory coils can handle all the extra weight of the gear that we normally carry with us. So there's been quite a bit of sag up front thanks to the winch and steel bumper that we have, and then our gear in the back, it's been sagging quite a bit. So we talked to our friends over at Rancho, and they were kind enough to hook us up with one of their brand new 2-inch sport lift kits made for the Rubicon platform. So to help mitigate some of the problems that we've been seeing, we've already been running a set of Rancho RS5000 X shocks made for the JL Wrangler, so we won't have to reinstall them. But what we will do is install these new coils and these bump stop extensions and a few of the other hardware that come with this kit to make it a complete package, and then we'll get to test it out. So Rancho was nice enough to send us both of these front bump stop extensions. They were concerned that we might have rubbing issues without this tall guy, but from what we've seen with our 2.5-inch coil spacer lift, I think we can get by with this one right here. So that's what we're going to install. All right, so now we got the Jeep racked up. It's time to take off the wheels and tires. 22mm socket. Gonna need this guy because of the type of lug nuts we have. Make sure it's on reverse. We're gonna go ahead and start on the front end first. So we're gonna just take off the wheels and tires up front and just get everything done here first, and then we'll move over to the back. Okay, just from past experience, we know that if we lower the axle far enough to pull out the coils, things like the locker and the FAD, the wiring for them, will get really tight, if not pull right out of the motor or the units themselves. So we're gonna go ahead and disconnect those first. So in order to do that, there's a gray locking tab on top of the wiring harness itself, or the plug, that'll need to be pulled out, and then you can squeeze and just pull entirely out like this. Now we're going to go over to the passenger side of the Jeep and disconnect the FAD wiring harness as well. Just like with the locker wiring harness, there is a locking tab that'll need to be pulled out first, and then you can squeeze the plug itself and pull it out. Okay. In order to take off some of the components like the sway bar links, the shocks, and even the track bar, we're going to go ahead and alleviate some of the weight of the front axle so that not all of it's just hanging down. We're going to use a floor jack to do that and make everything else a lot easier. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the sway bar links, and then we'll do the front shocks as well. So we're going to need our 18mm wrench, and we're going to need an 18mm socket. So the Rancho kit that we just got comes with relocation brackets that would allow you to use the factory front sway bar links. Because of the lift that we've already got on here, we went ahead and relocated the rear sway bar links up front because they're a lot longer. So for our purposes, we're just going to go ahead and disconnect them from the axle so that we can lower it and get everything else out. Again, we're already running these Rancho RS5000X shocks, so we're not going to have to replace them. So we're just going to go ahead and disconnect them from the axle And we're going to go ahead and use an 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench to do that now. Now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the front track bar from the front axle just so that we can get all the droop we can to get these coils out. 21mm socket, ratchet extension. We're going to go ahead now and carefully and slowly lower the front axle, double checking everything as we go down just so that nothing's getting hung up or getting pulled out, and that should allow us to pull out the front springs. Because we already have a 2.5-inch coil spacer lift installed, we also have front bump stop extensions that are attached to the front axle. Now that the front axle is completely drooped out, we can go ahead and unbolt those now, and that'll make it possible for us to pull out the coils. Accessing the bump stop extension bolt on the passenger side of the front axle is a little bit trickier because you have things like the track bar bracket and other components that are in the way. But one of the things that you can do is go ahead and disconnect the brake line bracket, which is attached to the back side of the lower spring perch, and you'll need a 10mm socket to do that, and that'll give you plenty of access up the back side of the axle. Okay. There you have it. So before we can install the brand new Rancho coils, we're going to have to remove the coil spacer that we currently have installed. Take the coil isolator. So if there's something that should be noted about the Rancho 2-inch lift kit for the JL Wrangler Rubicon, is that they took notice of the fact that the JL Wrangler itself comes with corner-specific coils, as in each coil on each corner of the Jeep itself is of a different size or a different length. So each one of the coils that Rancho provides are also a different length as well. So you can see here that the passenger side front coil is ever so slightly taller, or maybe even measurably taller, than the driver's side. On this one here it says LF as in left front, and over here it's RF as in right front. Before we can install the coil, we're going to grab a bump stop extension. Go over here. Now we're going to go ahead and install the new coils that we got with the Rancho 2-inch lift kit. So to start, we're going to go ahead and take our coil isolator that needs to go back up into the upper spring perch. So I should point out there are a couple nubs on the coil isolator itself. Originally I had cut these off so that I can install our budget boost or our coil spacer lift, but they still need to go in according to the holes that are on the upper spring perch. So I'm going to go ahead and slide this up the bump stop tower now. So once again, you want to make sure that you have the correct coil that you're installing on each side because they are all corner specific. This right here says LF as in left front, so that's what we're going to install now. And before you do that, you're going to want to grab your bump stop extension with hardware installed already or slip through it, place it in the bottom of the coil. The lower coil isolator is indexed, and you want to make sure that the coil terminates at that point as well. With the coils installed, we can now go ahead and secure the bump stop extension to the front axle. As you can see, the bolt that's fed through the bump stop extension needs to go into the hole in the axle itself. We're going to take our nylock nut and washer and we're going to feed it up underneath the spring perch itself. In order to make this work, we're going to go ahead and use a 9/16 inch socket and a 9/16 inch wrench to tie it all together. Now that we've got the coils installed and the bump stop extension secured to the front axle, we just need to finish things up by reinstalling our shocks and sway bar links, and then we'll get to the other components as well. This brake line bracket is normally attached to the factory lower control arm, but because we replaced them with a set of adjustable Evo control arms, we went ahead and drilled out a hole right here, and we now can attach it onto the shock mount. Using an 18mm socket and wrench, we can go ahead and secure the shock to the lower axle mount. While we're here, we're also going to go ahead and reinstall the driver's side sway bar link onto the axle as well. Once again, we're going to go ahead and use an 18mm socket and wrench to secure this in place. Before we can reinstall the shock and sway bar links on the passenger side of the axle, we're going to have to actually reconnect the brake line bracket that we disconnected earlier. So again, you're going to need a 10mm socket in order to do that. I should note that there's a tab and a slot on the back side of the lower spring perch that you're going to need to get this thing slipped into before you can get this slid in and secured in place. Okay. All right, so now we can go ahead and reinstall our plugs. Go ahead and plug that in as well. All right, everything's reconnected except for the front track bar, which we will attach again once the whole weight of the vehicle is on the ground. So for now, we're going to go ahead and put on the front wheels and tires again. Torque wrench. Before we wrap everything up, we're going to go ahead and torque a few of the nuts and bolts that we probably should have done before we even put on the tires, but it's never too late, so we're going to do that now. If you just installed a brand new set of these Rancho RS5000X shocks, the upper shock bolt needs to be tightened to 81 foot-pounds of torque, and the lower bolt needs to be tightened up to 75 foot-pounds. The front sway bar link bolts at the axle mount need to be tightened to 60 foot-pounds of torque. All right, now that we got the front end, for the most part, all finished up, we're gonna move over to the rear end of our Jeep JL Wrangler and start by taking off the wheels and tires. As we did up front, we're gonna go ahead and take a floor jack and place it underneath the rear axle and lift it up just a little bit to make it easier to remove all its components. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and remove the bolt and nut securing the rear shocks to the axle. And we're going to need an 18mm socket and wrench to do that. Because we're going to be installing the rear sway bar links that came with this Rancho kit, we're going to go ahead and remove the sway bar links that we have on right now. Before I get ahead of myself, I'm going to go ahead and remove or unplug the locker wiring harness that's attached to the axle now, just so that when we lower the axle, it doesn't get pulled out of it. Okay. So we already have bump stop extensions installed, but we're going to actually see if we can get away with installing something that's a little bit shorter, and that's what comes with the Rancho kit. So we're going to go ahead and remove these ones now. And we're going to need a 1/2-inch wrench on either side to do that now. Once again, just like we did up front, we're going to go ahead and remove the bolt securing the track bar to the rear axle, just to allow us to get a little bit more droop and make it easier to pull out the springs. Now that everything's disconnected and from what I can tell everything unplugged as well, we're going to go ahead and lower the axle so that we can pull out the springs. Okay, with the axle drooped out, we can go ahead and remove the coils now. Before we can get the new Rancho springs installed, I've got to remove the 2.5-inch coil spacers that we have installed already. So that's what we're going to do right now. Just like up front, the rear coils on this Rancho 2-inch lift kit are corner specific. And you can see right here, they're labeled with an LR for left rear or an RR for a right rear. And if you look, you can clearly see that the passenger side is once again taller than the driver's side, just like they would have been from the factory. All right, so we're going to go ahead and take a look at this thing and see if we can install it. You can see that's what it looks like. Okay, part of the problem that we have with the JL is the fact that these emergency brake cables are routed up and over this cross member. I'm going to guess that they put this here so that it doesn't come into contact with any of these fuel lines, but the problem is that as the axle droops down, they really get hung up. on the cross member itself. So what we're going to do is reroute it, and to begin we're going to remove this bolt attaching this bracket to the tub using a 13mm socket, and then we'll free it up from the axles and then reroute it. So now that we have the emergency brake cable bracket released from the tub, we're going to disconnect it from the drum assembly itself, and we're going to use some vice grips in order to do that. Okay, so now that we have the emergency brake cable released from the brake assembly, I'm going to go ahead and release it from this bracket as well. There we go. Now that we have the emergency brake cable bracket removed from the body and disconnected from the brake assemblies themselves, we can now lower the rear axle just a little bit more and make it a lot easier to install the new coils. Before you install your rear coils, you want to make sure that you have the correct one for the correct side. Of course, I'm starting with the driver's side, so we want to make sure that we have the LR, which stands for left rear. Also, it's important to note that the rubber isolator that goes on top of the coil is indexed, and you want to make sure that it is placed accordingly. And this nub right here that's pointing up, this has a specific hole on the frame itself in the upper spring perch that it needs to go into. Now that we've got the rear coils installed, we're going to go ahead and install the new rear sway bar links that Rancho provided with their lift kit. So as you can see, these sway bar links are more like factory in that they have the stud already attached to the link itself. So we'll go ahead and install that end right here. So the upper link will need to be held in place using an 18mm wrench, and then we'll use a 19mm wrench to secure it in place. As before, we're going to use an 18mm socket and wrench to secure the links to the axle. So just like up front, the sway bar links are going to require 60 foot-pounds of torque when they're tightened up. Okay, so I just got the rear sway bar links installed, and while I would love to install the rear shocks onto the axle as well, the DRS, or the dynamic rebound spring technology inside of it, is preventing it from extending all the way out. That means that the mount and the bushing on the shock are still sitting kind of far away from each other, so I'm going to hold off and install that once the full weight of the vehicle is back on the ground. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and move over and install all the other components, such as the bump stop extensions, and as you can see here, the holes are offset, and these need to line up pointing inward into the vehicle. So take our hardware, fish into the holes. Okay, using a 1/2-inch wrench or a 13mm wrench on both ends, we're going to go ahead and then secure these bolts in place now. Okay, so now what we're going to do is relocate our emergency brake cables. Currently, they're running up and over the frame rail cross member, and we're going to reroute them underneath and use the bracket provided by Rancho to help secure it to the cross member, and we're going to recycle the brackets that came from the factory to hold it in place. As I said, you can see where the emergency brake cables are going up and over the cross member here, so we're going to go ahead and try to reroute this somehow. Comes down and under. Okay, that's one. All right, so we got those underneath now. So we're going to need to install this bracket that Rancho provided with their kit, and it's going to attach to this point on the cross member using their hardware. I went ahead and used a 19mm wrench to secure this bolt in place. Now we're going to take the factory bracket and bolt, and using this nylock nut end washer provided by Rancho to secure everything to the bottom of this bracket. Okay, using a 13mm socket and wrench, we're going to go ahead and secure factory bracket onto this new Rancho bracket. So So we're going to go ahead and reconnect the brake cable there. We're going to go ahead and rehook the emergency brake cable to the brake assembly. All right, we can go ahead and plug in our locker again, lock it in place. All right, I think we've got everything that we can installed and tightened up, torqued to spec, with the exception of the shocks and the rear track bar. So we're gonna go ahead and reinstall the rear tires and wheels and get it back on the ground, and we'll get everything else tightened up. Coming down. Now that we've got our Jeep on the ground, it'll be a lot easier to get these shocks installed, and so that's what I'm going to do now. Again, using an 18mm socket end wrench, I'm going to go ahead and fasten these two together now. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and tighten up the lower shock bolts to 75 foot-pounds of torque. Now we need to reconnect the track bar. And as you can see here, it's probably not going to line up. It's off by quite a bit. So what we're going to do is have somebody push the Jeep in the opposite direction to get them lined up. All right, I think that's about it. All right, using a 21mm socket, we're going to go ahead and zip this thing on, and then we'll torque it. This should be tightened up to 125 foot-pounds of torque. All right, I think we got the back end all wrapped up. Everything's connected, everything's been torqued. Let's go up to the front and finish that up too. Okay, just like the rear end, the track bar here you can see is off by maybe like 1/2 of an inch. So we're gonna have someone sit inside, turn the steering wheel a bit just to get them to line up. A little more, and stop. Okay, so we got the bolt in, and now we're just gonna go ahead and tighten that up. All right, now that we got that thing zipped on, we're gonna go ahead and make sure that it's torqued to 125 foot-pounds torque, just like we did on the rear. Okay, so now that we've got the full weight of the Jeep on the ground, everything's installed, everything's tightened up to torque spec, we're gonna go ahead and tighten up the lug nuts to torque spec, and that'll be 130 foot-pounds torque. As a side note, we installed Evo adjustable control arms with our previous lift, so for our purposes, nothing else needs to be done. But for you guys out there, I'm going to assume that you're going to be installing with factory control arms just like these. As you can see, the factory control arms have clevi bushings, or what are also known as bonded rubber bushings. And because of it, as you lift your Jeep, these bushings will be in a state of bind. So you're going to want to loosen up all the nuts and bolts securing your control arms to the axle and frame, and then retighten them up to torque spec. According to Rancho's instructions, you're going to want to tighten up the front lower control arm bolts to 190 foot-pounds of torque. In order to do this, you're going to need a 21mm socket and a 24mm wrench. The upper control arm is going to need an 18mm wrench and socket, and according to Rancho, they want you tightening them up to 80 foot-pounds of torque. The rear upper control arm should be tightened to 120 foot-pounds of torque at the frame, 95 foot-pounds at the axle, and then all the lower control arm bolts should be tightened to 90 foot-pounds of torque. The last thing you're going to need to do is recenter your steering wheel, and it'll be helpful to have a friend to keep an eye on it as you make adjustments to your drag link. Now you're going to need a 15mm wrench like this to loosen up the nut securing the drag link clamp adjuster in place, and then once it's free, you can rotate the adjuster up or down until the steering wheel is straight again. And we can retighten it again. All right, that's all there is to it. Let's get out there and test it out. Okay, so we just got this Rancho sport lift installed on our JL Wrangler, and so now we're taking it out on its maiden voyage. All right, so we're gonna take on a couple of these speed bumps from hell that are pretty close to our house, so let's give it a feel. Not too bad. There's another one. Not bad. Honestly, compared to what we were on before, it was a lot better. These are probably the worst speed bumps I've ever driven over. They're short, they're tall, they're meant to deliver impact, and they do. So here, we'll go over it again. That's not that bad. I think this setup with the new shocks and springs is handling these speed bumps much better. All right, so we've had a chance to drive this Jeep around town, and so far, I think the ride is really nice. So we're gonna head on over to an area that we know that the road isn't really maintained and it's a little bit rougher, and we're gonna get an idea of how it feels there. So we came out here knowing this road's gonna be rough, and it is, but while it may not be as smooth as silk, it is a huge improvement over what we were riding on before. So for that, we're pretty happy. While a budget boost will get your Jeep JL Wrangler sitting a bit taller and on the cheap, it'll do so at the cost of your ride quality. Just so that it isn't missed, this lift kit costs $640. If you're lucky enough to buy it while Rancho has one of their awesome rebate programs going on, you're out to save an additional $100. Based on the testing that we've done, we found this lift kit to offer a much smoother ride, corner significantly better, and be way more comfortable off-road than any coil spacer and shock extension could ever hope to be. While it does cost a bit more, it's just a bit more. And in my opinion, it's a much better way to boost up your JL on a budget. Be sure to check out the next episode of the JL Journal, where you'll get to see us testing this lift out on the trail.